Hey everyone, and welcome. Today, we are cracking open one of the most incredible food stories you'll ever hear. We're talking about how the lobster, one of the most luxurious foods on the planet, started its life in America as something people absolutely despised. It is a wild rags-to-riches story.
I mean, just look at this contrast. On the one side, you've got today's lobster, a fancy, fine dining luxury, a symbol of wealth. And on the other side, yesterday's lobster was literally prison food. It was used as fertilizer. People called it the cockroach of the sea. So the big question is, how on earth did this happen? How did a creature with that kind of reputation become a global symbol of luxury? Well, let's get into it.
All right, so our story kicks off way back in colonial America. And you have to understand, back then, lobster wasn't a delicacy. It was a straight-up nuisance. We're not talking about a rare treat, we're talking about an overwhelming plague of crustaceans.
Can you even imagine this? The first European settlers would wake up after a big storm, walk out to the beach, and find it literally covered in 2-foot-high piles of live lobsters. This wasn't a gift from the sea. It was a smelly, crawling, disgusting mess that they had to clean up.
And this quote from the 1800s, man, it just says it all. Having lobster shells around your house wasn't a sign that you just had some amazing dinner. Nope, it was a public announcement that you were poor, that you were desperate, that you were at the very bottom of the social ladder.
The nickname really sums it up: cockroach of the sea. People saw them as these gross bottom feeders. And hey, if that's not bad enough, get this. The word lobster actually comes from an Old English word for spider. So in the minds of the colonists, they were basically being forced to eat giant armored sea spiders. Yuck.
And if you want to see the hard numbers, this is where it gets really wild. In the mid-1800s, a pound of canned lobster cost just 11 cents. Now compare that to a pound of Boston baked beans, which was 53 cents. That's right, lobster was 5 times cheaper than beans. It was the definition of poverty food. So what do you do with all of these cheap, unwanted sea cockroaches? Well, you feed them to prisoners. You feed them to indentured servants. In fact, it got so bad that some servants in Massachusetts actually had to put into their contracts that their masters couldn't feed them lobster more than 3 times a week. The rest, it was just ground up for fertilizer, used for fish bait, or fed to the pigs.
But then, right around the middle of the 19th century, everything started to shift. This is the big turning point in the story, where a little bit of technology and some really smart marketing began the lobster's incredible climb from the absolute bottom to the very top.
It really came down to 3 key things that happened almost all at once. First, the railroad started expanding west, which opened up a whole new way to transport food. Second, the canning industry just exploded, which meant you could preserve lobster and ship it anywhere. And third, and this one is huge, was a culinary discovery. Chefs figured out that if you cook a lobster while it's still alive, the meat is unbelievably sweet and tender, not tough and gross. And this is where the marketing genius kicks in. The railroad managers realized, hey, people in the Midwest have never even seen a lobster before. They have no idea that it's considered trash food back on the East Coast. So what did they do? They started serving it in their fancy dining cars, calling it a rare, exotic delicacy from the sea. And the passengers, they absolutely loved it. Just like that, demand was created out of thin air.
So with this brand new demand, the lobster entered the 20th century basically ready for its close-up. It was time to finally shed that old, disgusting reputation for good and become a true American icon of luxury. And the rise was fast. I mean, by the late 1800s, you had these extravagant restaurants in New York City called lobster palaces. They became the place to be seen for the rich and famous. Suddenly, eating lobster wasn't a sign of being poor anymore. It was a performance of your wealth and your sophistication.
But its status wasn't totally secure just yet. In the Roaring '20s, it hit its first big price peak. It was pure Gatsby-era indulgence. But then the Great Depression hit and the luxury market just evaporated. It crashed right back down to being cheap canned food again. The real final turning point was World War II. See, while beef and other meats were being heavily rationed, lobster wasn't. So people from all social classes started eating it, and its popularity just exploded. By the 1950s, its place was set. Lobster was officially a delicacy.
And that brings us to today. The lobster's reputation was completely transformed. But why does it stay so expensive? Well, it's not just about perception anymore. There are real, modern reasons.
Okay, so a huge factor is that lobsters are just notoriously difficult to farm. They grow really slowly, they eat a ton, and they get sick easily when they're all packed together. So what that means is that our entire global supply pretty much depends on fishermen going out and catching them in the wild. And that, naturally, limits how many we can get.
So you've got this combination of factors keeping the price high. There's a really complex supply chain just to get them from the ocean floor to your plate alive. You've got climate change messing with their habitats. There are strict fishing rules to make sure we don't wipe them out. But maybe the most powerful factor of all is our own perception. That rebranding campaign was so successful that now we just expect lobster to be expensive. And that kind of completes the cycle.
And you can see the real-world impact of all these challenges right in Maine, which is the heart of the American lobster industry. In 2023, the harvest was down to 93.8 million pounds. That's a huge drop from its peak of over 132 million pounds back in 2016. And you know what lower supply plus high demand means? Higher prices.
From a ceasefire to a status symbol, the lobster's journey is one of the greatest rebranding stories ever. And it leaves us with a really fascinating question, right? If marketing and technology and just plain perception could turn the cockroach of the sea into a treasure, what cheap, common food that we all take for granted today is going to become the luxury of tomorrow?